product placement, quote unquote. I've got a blog article out on, the opportunity for schools to integrate better with reality TV programming, for instance, right? Sounds like kind of an, out of the blue, out of the box idea, but there's just at a high level so much reality oriented programming right now, right? And so much of that is people, accomplishing something or wanting to turn their life around, or there's a real and meaningful opportunity for marketers in the higher ed space to integrate their school with that, right? And they've done a little bit of it, 5 years ago with Dr. Phil giving away a scholarship. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real, meaningful people that are trying to transform their lives. Somebody's filming it for a show. We can all think of a couple of examples. As I've talked to higher education leaders about those opportunities, first question is, how many leads does that create? And, the first most honest answer is, I don't know, because nobody's done it before. So let's, everybody wants to talk about innovation. Let's try it. But two, you will get web traffic, right? But how good is your web game? Because that's what I was saying earlier. You've got to reverse engineer the whole process, because if somebody comes to your portal and everybody's talking about all this awesome transformational stuff that you helped Sally do, who was a single mom and an alcoholic, and now she's sober and her kids are in school, and, she's now studying to be a nurse, and we've all watched it on Lifetime, that's awesome. But then if they get to your website and it's people in pajamas, on the laptop, go to school anytime and get a great, it's just that the messaging doesn't match. It's that old fashioned messaging. You're going to have wasted a lot of money, right? So, but product placement is a good example of something folks haven't probably thought a lot about. Those opportunities are out there. I talk to those folks. Product placement has swept through every other consumer vertical I can think of. And I cannot get a higher education leader to not ask the first question, how many times will the call center ring the morning after? And if it doesn't fit in the box, they have a challenge buying. And I think that's why higher education is a good example. They've been behind the times in some cases.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of similar trends where the first question asked around the tactic, that's why I asked about attribution, right? The first question is always, right, how many leads? What was the cost per enrollment? Like the classic metrics. And you made a great point, right? You need those metrics in order to scale. You do need to understand what's going on, right? It's not that it's not important, but it's hard to test into new channels, and people underestimate just how many touch points it really takes these days. Like no one's going on Facebook and immediately clicking through to your ad, immediately filling out your form, and then 2 days later becoming a student. Like that's just not, the journey is a little bit longer from what we've found. And it's hard if you don't have wiggle room in your budget to do Snapchat, to do TikTok, to do YouTube ads, because if you just look at it straight up direct response and you compare it to a Google or you compare it to something else, the cost per lead, cost per enrollment is going to look terrible on paper. And the first thing those higher ups are going to say is, well, why are you even running this? Right? So it creates this hard challenge because you need to do it. But you don't really have the math to back it up. And it's sort of like a trust me sort of thing that folks get into. Do you find that that's accurate, or have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's tough. And that's what I was saying earlier, where you've got an industry that, for better or worse, is led by folks that are trying to recapture. When online first hit, 2000, 2010, we were all growing, right? And it was easier, and again, the game was efficiency and operations and building scale. And there's just a challenge with migrating to a new playbook. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, we can all think of other. It's hard to think. Right? I'm sure Kamaar, somebody could come up with an outlier. It's hard to think of pure direct response companies that sustain, right? They just, the internet allowed us to scale so fast. But those companies have typically burned out pretty quick because you churn through your addressable market. There has to be some depth and some additional value in your brand, and you have to consciously build that. And I think just you've got, again, a great bifurcation of higher education, because you got a top 30 institutions that have that in spades, right? And they've been doing it for 200, 300 years. Obviously, we're not talking about those institutions, but then you've got a lot which are just, it's a commodity at this point, right? An online MBA is a commodity if you're not going to one of the top 30, and folks have really struggled with how to break out of that.
Right.
Yep.
So this is a question I have, right? This is a tough one, and this was really to both of you guys, right? So, read a book, Art of Worldly Wisdom by Balthazar Gracian, and the first maxim is that everything is always at its peak, right? So following up on what Jason was just saying, right? Competition is at an all-time high, right? Your ability to be agile or the need to be agile is at an all-time high, right? You have to be extremely dynamic and able to pivot, right? So how do you balance the need for automation, right? The birth of automation with the fear or the not wanting to be transactional, but yet still having to emotionally connect and customize your message, right? How much is that? How much is that a challenge right
I mean, to me, it's everything. I mean, because the overlay here is it's an economically challenged time, and in higher ed, that extends further back than just the current crisis, right? Schools have been running at a very thin margin. If you're not state supported or federally subsidized, it's been a very challenging environment. And so as the economics got worse, as the capital left, because it's no longer the great economic investment it maybe was 10, 15 years ago, your ability to take a risk, right, is harder. And if you think about it in our own personal lives, right, like if I've got $1 million in the bank and nothing to lose and it's always worked, well, it's easier to bet. So I hear you. I mean, that's everything, and that's why it takes entrepreneurialism, it takes courage, and it takes some of those intangibles. It really is. But to me, to answer your question, it's a crisis of leadership, and it's a lack of pure, true entrepreneurialism within higher education. Right? None of us can name a fantastic entrepreneur who is purely invested in higher ed in the last decade. We can in social, we can in everything. I mean, everything has had an infusion of entrepreneurial talent. Cars, look at car, I mean, really old traditional businesses, new businesses. Higher education just has not been a sexy enough sector. The regulations has been tough. The demographics have turned on us from where they were 20 years ago, and we just don't have that type of entrepreneurial talent. I know it's not the greatest answer you're looking for there because it's not, easy to unpack, but that's a challenge. It's going to take, a true entrepreneur saying, we're going to have to place some bets.
Right. Yeah. So you're like Elon Musk, who's the Jeff Bezos of education, right?
That's right. And I mean, let's be clear. Elon's a great example, and I've been very critical in some of my other outlets. I'll spare you guys my Elon stories, but very critical of Elon Musk. But again, this is right on the heels of the launch. I mean, SpaceX he was within days of going bankrupt in 2008. Like, within days, putting crap on credit cards, trying to build a rocket. Many of us, myself included, laughed when you at first heard the idea. He is going to build rockets that are reusable and will take people to the space station as a private company. I mean, it was a joke. It was an absolute, and here we are, right? None of us can name something like that in higher ed in the last 20 years. And that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say part of it too is there's a trust factor, there's a risk tolerance, because ultimately it at its core, it is transactional, right? It is a business. So we have a customer that's worth X, and we're paying Y to acquire them, and how much margin are we going to make, right? That's the fundamental of any business. But the problem is we're in this weird time where, to your point, Jason, people need to invest in brand, right? But it takes a leap of faith, and it takes a person who really understands how to do it properly, because you're going to see your transactional metrics that you're used to looking at, you're going to see them go down short term. So you have to first, one, be able to accept that they're going to go down. And then the question becomes, to what level do I want them to go down? So if my cost per enrollment is X, I'm willing to take it to Y during this defined time frame in which I'm going to do X, Y, Z to build brand, right? You talked about those direct response focused companies. I worked in direct response for a long time, a lot of big brands. And the funniest thing was always, if you take the brand, let's just take Google search, basic example. If you take their brand campaign and turn it off, what happens to the efficiency of that channel? It disappears. It absolutely crumbles because people need the brand to deliver a customer for 1/100th of what non-brand is going to deliver. And that helps average out your acquisition. But people are they're still kind of behind the times, right? Like you were talking about earlier, they're still looking for it to be very transactional. And it's impossible, if you look at it that way, to invest in brands. But the problem is that's exactly what people need to do right now, especially as we talked about before, with it becoming more emotional, right? You need to have an emotional connection with what? With a brand, right? So if you don't have a brand, what are they connecting to? Your lead form and then your call center. Like there's no tangible brand that they're even really interacting with. So it takes a lot of vision and risk tolerance, and really just defining, hey, what is my time frame, and what am I willing to tolerate with my traditional financial metrics in order to make this a reality?
Yeah, and so as in the spirit of practical application, because you're dead on, the way I've tried to approach this over the last 3 years is to get as informed and brutally objective about the current mix as possible. So you mentioned the economics aren't great, but we would further kind of break our economic unit model by suddenly, funneling a lot of money to a new channel that didn't really, metricize and operationalize the way the others did. So what I've tried to do is one of the best pieces of advice. You mentioned Google. This was a seminar, and at the time it was the head of, the guy that was the head of data for Google. This was at this point now, maybe even 10 years ago. And somebody asked him, if you had one piece of advice for somebody trying to, build a marketing engine from the ground up, what would it be? And he said, de-average. It was the most brilliant answer I've ever. One word, right? And the guy's on the stage, 10,000 pages, de-average. So if you can take your current mix, and this is the work that some great marketers, I'm sure like yourselves, will do, but other folks, it hasn't been the way they thought. You've got to get as granular as humanly possible and segment your entire mix. Be brutally honest about every channel. Doesn't matter what they did a year ago. Look at what they're producing today. You're going to have fat in there. We've all inherited situations or looked at mixes or looked at plans or buys where, you've got, it's a Pareto thing, right? 20% of your buys producing 80% of your results, right? And so you've got to start to wade in to some of what we're talking about: brand building, testing new channels, Snap, maybe it's really getting smart about SMS or content, product placement. Start to cut some of those underperforming segments. Again, even if historically they performed, if lately they're waning, the more you segment and be creative and strategic and splice some of those things out, that's where you start to carve some of your money out and place some bets. Now, conceptually, that sounds pretty easy, right? But you really got to get analytical, objective in segment. Don't have 2 to 3 archetypal type students that you get from various channels. People need to take that to 10 to 20 and really look at every channel, every segment, every archetype, and then look at lifetime value too. There's a lot of myths that people tell themselves about their conversion model in higher ed, but when you extend that to lifetime value, there's this inverse relationship at times where your easiest students to convert are the ones that produce the least amount of revenue because they jumped right into college and they jumped right out and they're jumping into something else next month. And I personally am shocked. As the institutions I talk to, folks who reach out for help, I ask to see lifetime value model by segment. I have yet to have somebody that I've never worked with produce that freely. I can go into Coke, Kellogg, you name it, Ford, everybody has those metrics in consumer because they work, right? And as higher ed moves to more of a consumer mindset, right, where it was kind of the empire where we all sat here and students just kind of jumped over the fence because they needed a college degree. That was 10, 15 years ago. This is a consumer market now, brutally competitive. Every other industry that's gone through this, any head of marketing can tell you lifetime value. And again, they can drill down to by segment. I've yet to meet a higher ed marketer, and I'm sure they're out there, right? I'm just saying I haven't met one that can quote those numbers off the top of the head like somebody from Procter.